England in 1815 stood at the precipice of social transformation, yet the rigid hierarchy of the aristocracy remained as immutable as the ancient oak trees that dotted the countryside estates. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars had brought prosperity to some and hardship to others, creating an even sharper divide between the privileged few and the laboring masses. In the rolling hills of Hertfordshire, where morning mist clung to perfectly manicured gardens and afternoon light filtered through diamond-paned windows of Georgian mansions, the rules of society were written in stone and blood. The Pemberton estate stretched across 2,000 acres of prime English countryside, its main house a testament to 3 centuries of accumulated wealth and political influence. Built in the classical Georgian style, Pemberton Hall rose 4 stories high, its limestone facade adorned with Corinthian columns and intricate carved moldings that spoke of old money and older traditions. The grand entrance hall, with its marble floors imported from Italian quarries and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed the coronations of kings, served as a daily reminder to all who entered of their place in the natural order of things. Lord William Pemberton, the 5th Earl of Hertfordshire, ruled this domain with the same iron will that had made his ancestors trusted advisers to the crown. His marriage to Lady Catherine Ashworth had been arranged when both were still in their cradles, a union that merged 2 of England's most powerful families and doubled their combined holdings. Their son, Master Alexander Pemberton, born in the spring of 1805, was destined from his first breath to inherit not just wealth and title, but the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. The social structure that governed life at Pemberton Hall was as complex as it was unforgiving. Below the family level existed a carefully ordered hierarchy of servants, each with their designated place and prescribed duties. The butler, Mr. Harrison, commanded respect even from lesser members of the gentry who called upon the Earl. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, governed an army of chambermaids, kitchen staff, and laundresses with the efficiency of a military commander. The head groundskeeper oversaw dozens of gardeners who maintained the elaborate formal gardens, complete with hedge mazes, ornamental lakes, and conservatories filled with exotic plants from the furthest reaches of the empire. Among this carefully ordered world lived the Blackwood family, whose service to the Pembertons stretched back 4 generations. Thomas Blackwood served as the Earl's personal valet, a position of considerable trust and responsibility. His wife, Margaret, had been appointed as governess to young Master Alexander, her refined education and gentle manner making her invaluable in shaping the future Earl's character. Their daughter, Miss Isabella Blackwood, born in the same spring as Alexander, occupied an unusual position in the household hierarchy, too well educated and refined to be considered merely a servant's child, yet forever barred by birth from true equality with her aristocratic contemporary. The England of 1815 was a nation where protocol governed every interaction, where the difference between a curtsy and a bow could determine one's social standing for years to come. Ladies of quality never appeared in public without their gloves, their heads uncovered, or their reputations unguarded by proper chaperonage. Gentlemen of breeding conducted themselves according to strict codes of honor that governed everything from the correct way to offer one's arm to a lady to the precise etiquette of calling upon acquaintances. Marriage among the upper classes was rarely a matter of personal inclination, but rather a calculated merger of fortunes, bloodlines, and political alliances. The morning routine at Pemberton Hall began before dawn, when the kitchen staff lit the great fireplaces and began preparations for the elaborate meals that would mark the rhythm of the aristocratic day. Breakfast was served in the morning room at precisely 8 o'clock, featuring delicacies imported from across the empire, exotic teas from Ceylon, preserves made from fruits grown in the estate's own hothouses, and fresh bread baked daily in ovens that had served the family for generations. The afternoon brought calling hours, when neighbors of suitable rank might pay their respects, engaging in carefully choreographed conversations that revealed as much by what was left unsaid as by what was spoken aloud. Evening entertainment in such households was an elaborate affair, whether hosting intimate dinner parties for 12 or grand balls for 200 guests. The ballroom at Pemberton Hall could accommodate 4 full sets of country dances, its parquet floors polished to mirror brightness beneath chandeliers holding 300 candles each. Musicians were imported from London for special occasions, their repertoire including the latest waltzes from Vienna alongside traditional English country dances that had been performed by generations of aristocratic families. The libraries of such estates served as repositories not just of literature and learning, but of family history and social memory. The Pemberton Library contained first editions of works by Shakespeare, Milton, and Pope, alongside detailed genealogical records that traced family connections back to the Norman conquest. These leather-bound volumes, with their gilt edges and elaborate bookplates bearing the family crest, represented more than mere learning. They were tangible proof of cultural superiority and inherited refinement. In the golden summer of 1815, when young Alexander Pemberton reached his 10th year, the careful boundaries that separated the classes seemed as natural and immutable as the changing of the seasons. The future Earl was a thoughtful child, blessed with his mother's gentle disposition and his father's keen intelligence, though he possessed a curiosity about the world beyond his privileged sphere that occasionally troubled his tutors. His education followed the classical pattern expected of young gentlemen, Latin and Greek under the stern guidance of Mr. Pemberton's Cambridge-educated chaplain, mathematics and natural philosophy with a retired military officer, and the social graces under his mother's careful supervision. Isabella Blackwood, daughter of the trusted servants, presented a fascinating contradiction to the established order. Her mother's position as governess had afforded her an education far superior to that typically available to children of her class. She could read Latin poetry with the same ease as English novels, discuss the finer points of history and geography, and play the pianoforte with a skill that would have been admired in drawing rooms across London. Yet her birth marked her as forever separate from the world she had been taught to understand and appreciate. The children's friendship had begun in the nursery, where Margaret Blackwood's duties as governess naturally brought her daughter into daily contact with her young charge. Lady Catherine, observing her son's obvious loneliness in the vast halls of Pemberton Estate, had initially encouraged the companionship, viewing Isabella as a suitable playmate who could provide intellectual stimulation without the complications that might arise from friendships with children of equal social standing, whose families might harbor political or financial ambitions. Their childhood games took place in the elaborate gardens that surrounded Pemberton Hall, where ancient oak trees provided shade for lessons conducted outdoors during pleasant weather. They built elaborate castles from fallen leaves in autumn, staged dramatic productions of classical tales in the estate's small amphitheater during summer afternoons, and spent countless hours in the estate's extensive library, where Isabella's love of romantic poetry first began to bloom alongside Alexander's passion for historical chronicles and philosophical treatises. As they grew older, the differences in their positions became more pronounced and problematic. Alexander's days were increasingly filled with formal lessons designed to prepare him for his future role as Earl, instruction in estate management, political theory, and the subtle arts of diplomacy that would be essential in his dealings with other members of the aristocracy. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself caught between worlds, too educated for a life of domestic service yet barred by birth from the society her education had prepared her to enter. The turning point in their relationship came during the winter of 1820, when Alexander, now 15 and possessing the tall, lean frame that marked him as unmistakably a Pemberton, began to see Isabella not merely as his childhood companion but as a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence. Her dark hair, inherited from her Celtic grandmother, contrasted strikingly with the pale English complexion that spoke of her refined upbringing. Her eyes, the deep green of summer forests, seemed to hold depths of understanding that Alexander found increasingly compelling. Isabella, for her part, had always been aware of the growing impossibility of their friendship, yet found herself powerless to resist the magnetic pull of Alexander's presence. His kindness toward the estate workers, his genuine interest in ideas and literature, and his apparent obliviousness to the social barriers that should have separated them made him increasingly dear to her heart. She began to notice the way his hair caught the morning sunlight during their walks through the estate grounds, the genuine warmth of his laughter when she made some particularly clever observation, and the way his eyes seemed to seek her out across crowded rooms during the household's evening gatherings. The first sign of serious trouble came when Lady Catherine observed her son and Isabella engaged in an animated discussion of Lord Byron's latest verses in the estate library. The sight of her heir treating a servant's daughter as an intellectual equal struck her with the force of a physical blow. That evening, she summoned Margaret Blackwood for a private conference in her morning room, a conversation that would alter the course of both families' destinies. Lady Catherine, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk adorned with sapphires that had belonged to 5 generations of Pemberton women, spoke with the controlled precision that marked her as a master of aristocratic diplomacy. She praised Margaret's devoted service and acknowledged Isabella's exceptional qualities, while making it clear that the girl's continued presence in the household was becoming problematic. The future Earl, she explained with delicate but unmistakable firmness, required preparation for marriage alliances that would strengthen the family's political and financial position. Any emotional attachments that might interfere with these essential arrangements must be discouraged before they could take root. Margaret Blackwood, understanding the impossible position in which her daughter's education and refinement had placed her family, agreed to the Countess's request with the quiet dignity that had always marked her character. Isabella would be sent to live with relatives in London, where her accomplishments might secure her a position as governess in a respectable household far from Hertfordshire. The separation would be temporary, Lady Catherine assured her, just long enough for Alexander to adjust to his changing responsibilities and form appropriate social connections. The announcement of Isabella's impending departure struck Alexander with devastating force. For the first time in his privileged life, he found himself confronting the absolute nature of social hierarchy and his own powerlessness to change it. His attempts to speak with his parents about Isabella's situation were met with polite but inflexible refusal to discuss the matter further. The Earl, when pressed, reminded his son that duty to family and position must always supersede personal inclination, a lesson that every Pemberton had learned and that Alexander, too, must accept. Isabella received the news of her exile with the composure that her mother's training had instilled in her, though Alexander could see the pain she struggled to conceal. Their final conversation took place in the rose garden where they had spent so many happy hours of their childhood, surrounded by blooms whose perfection seemed to mock the tragedy unfolding between them. She spoke of duty and acceptance, of the natural order that had always governed their lives, while Alexander raged against the injustice of a system that valued birth over merit, position over character. The 5 years that followed Isabella's departure from Pemberton Hall passed like a blur of enforced social obligations and carefully orchestrated introductions for Alexander. Now 20 years old and bearing the courtesy title of Lord Ashworth, he had grown into a striking figure who drew admiring glances from eligible young ladies across the London social scene. His dark hair, worn in the fashionable style favored by romantic poets, framed features that bore the aristocratic refinement of his bloodline softened by an intelligence and sensitivity that set him apart from his more conventional peers. Lady Catherine had orchestrated an ambitious campaign to secure her son's marriage to Lady Margaret Fairfax, eldest daughter of the Duke of Westmoreland and one of the most sought-after heiresses of the season. Lady Margaret possessed all the qualities deemed essential in a future countess: impeccable bloodline stretching back to the Plantagenets, a dowry that would significantly enhance the Pemberton fortune, and the kind of polished beauty that graced the pages of fashionable ladies' magazines. Her accomplishments in French, Italian, painting, and music were precisely what society expected of a young woman of her elevated station. Yet despite the obvious advantages of such a match, Alexander found himself increasingly resistant to his parents' matrimonial ambitions. Lady Margaret, while undeniably beautiful and accomplished, seemed to him a creature of pure artifice, her conversation limited to the approved topics of weather, fashion, and society gossip. Her laugh, tinkling like expensive china, never seemed to reach her pale blue eyes, and her interest in literature extended only to the romantic novels deemed suitable for young ladies of quality. Most troubling of all, she displayed the casual cruelty toward those beneath her social station that Alexander had come to recognize as a hallmark of their class. Meanwhile, in London, Isabella had found employment as governess to the children of Sir Edmund Hartwell, a wealthy merchant whose recent knighthood had elevated him to the fringes of respectable society. The Hartwell household, while lacking the ancient grandeur of Pemberton Hall, offered Isabella a comfortable if somewhat ambiguous position. Her exceptional education and refined manners made her invaluable to Lady Hartwell, who sought to establish her family's credentials among the traditional aristocracy. Isabella's duties extended beyond mere instruction to include serving as a companion to Lady Hartwell during social calls and even attending certain public functions where her presence might lend an air of cultivation to the family's reputation. The social whirl of London during the 1820s was a complex dance of ambition, alliance, and carefully calculated display. The season brought together the cream of English society for a series of balls, exhibitions, and theatrical performances that served as both entertainment and battleground for matrimonial strategies. Young ladies made their debuts at elaborate presentation ceremonies, their futures hanging on the critical assessments of society matrons whose approval could make or break a reputation. Gentlemen of fortune and title found themselves the targets of ambitious mothers seeking advantageous matches for their daughters, while fortune hunters and social climbers sought any opportunity to advance their positions. It was at Lady Pemberton's annual charity benefit for the education of orphan children that fate chose to reunite Alexander and Isabella after their 5 years of separation. The event, held in the Grand Ballroom of Pemberton House in Mayfair, drew together London's most influential philanthropists for an evening of moral purpose disguised as fashionable entertainment. Isabella attended as companion to Lady Hartwell, her role requiring her to remain somewhat apart from the main festivities while ensuring her employer's comfort and social success. Alexander first glimpsed Isabella across the crowded ballroom, her figure elegant in a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her striking coloring while maintaining the understated sophistication appropriate to her position. The intervening years had transformed the thoughtful girl he remembered into a woman of remarkable beauty and poise, her natural grace enhanced by the confidence that came from successfully navigating London society. Her dark hair was arranged in the classical style favored by fashionable ladies, adorned with a single strand of pearls that spoke of quiet elegance rather than ostentatious display. The moment of recognition struck both of them with the force of lightning. Across the elaborate ballroom, through the swirling crowd of aristocrats and social climbers, their eyes met with the same electric intensity that had marked their childhood connection. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat as 5 years of carefully maintained composure crumbled in an instant. Isabella's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she gripped her fan, her training in social deportment warring with the overwhelming emotion that threatened to betray her carefully maintained facade. Their first conversation in 5 years took place in Lady Pemberton's morning room, where Alexander had retreated to escape the suffocating attention of matchmaking mothers and their marriageable daughters. Isabella had sought the same refuge, claiming a need to retrieve Lady Hartwell's forgotten gloves from the cloakroom. The room, decorated in shades of cream and gold that reflected the family's refined taste, seemed to shrink around them as they found themselves alone for the first time since their painful separation. Alexander spoke first, his voice catching slightly as he attempted to maintain the formal courtesy that their respective positions demanded while his heart raced with emotions he had spent 5 years trying to suppress. Isabella responded with the measured politeness that her position required, yet neither could ignore the undercurrent of longing that colored every carefully chosen word. They spoke of London, of literature, of everything except the feelings that hung between them like a physical presence in the elaborately appointed room. The weeks that followed brought a series of carefully orchestrated encounters as Alexander found increasingly creative reasons to appear at social functions where Isabella might be present in her capacity as Lady Hartwell's companion. He discovered that she had continued her voracious reading during their separation, devouring works of history, philosophy, and poetry with the same passion that had marked her childhood. Her insights into contemporary political events and literary developments revealed a mind that had only grown more sophisticated and compelling during their years apart. Isabella, for her part, found herself caught between duty and desire as Alexander's attention became increasingly difficult to ignore or discourage. Her position in the Hartwell household, while comfortable, remained precarious, dependent on maintaining the delicate balance between usefulness and invisibility that marked the life of a genteel governess. Any scandal touching her reputation would mean immediate dismissal and the virtual impossibility of securing similar employment elsewhere. Yet Alexander's presence in her life awakened feelings she had convinced herself were safely buried in the past. Their clandestine courtship was conducted through a series of stolen moments and carefully coded communications that would have done credit to the most sophisticated diplomatic correspondence. Alexander would attend lectures at the Royal Institution, knowing that Isabella often accompanied the Hartwell children on educational outings. Isabella would linger in the lending libraries where Alexander had mentioned his intention to research particular topics. They developed an elaborate system of signals and arrangements that allowed them to meet without arousing the suspicions of their respective social circles. The turning point came during a visit to the British Museum, where Alexander had arranged to encounter Isabella while she supervised the education of the young Hartwells. Surrounded by the artifacts of ancient civilizations, they found themselves engaged in the kind of intellectual discourse that had marked their childhood friendship, yet charged now with an emotional intensity that neither could any longer deny. Alexander spoke passionately of his growing conviction that birth and title meant nothing compared to character and intelligence, while Isabella argued with equal fervor that social conventions, however unjust, could not be wished away by good intentions alone. The crisis that would forever alter the trajectories of both families erupted during the height of the London season of 1825, when society's attention was focused on the elaborate celebrations surrounding King George IV's continued reign and the prosperity that had followed England's victory over Napoleon. Lord Pemberton had finalized the marriage negotiations with the Duke of Westmoreland, and Alexander's engagement to Lady Margaret Fairfax was to be announced at a grand ball hosted by the Pemberton family at their Mayfair mansion. The Pemberton townhouse, a four-story Georgian masterpiece facing Hyde Park, had been transformed for the occasion into a glittering showcase of aristocratic power and refined taste. The ballroom, capable of accommodating 300 guests, blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in mirrors imported from French palaces. Hothouse flowers had been arranged in elaborate displays that perfumed the air with the scent of roses, jasmine, and exotic orchids cultivated in the family's private conservatories. The finest musicians in London had been engaged to provide entertainment, their repertoire including both traditional English country dances and the scandalous new waltzes that had recently gained acceptance among the more progressive members of society. Alexander stood beside his parents in the receiving line, resplendent in evening dress that had been tailored by London's most exclusive establishments. His black tailcoat, cut in the latest fashion, emphasized the lean strength of his frame, while his white silk waistcoat bore the subtle embroidery that marked it as the work of master craftsmen. The Pemberton family jewels, including the sapphire stickpin that had belonged to his great-grandfather and the signet ring bearing the family crest, proclaimed his heritage to all who observed him. Yet despite his magnificent appearance, those who knew him well could detect the tension in his posture and the shadows that darkened his typically warm brown eyes. Lady Margaret arrived precisely at the appointed hour, her entrance calculated to create the maximum impression upon the assembled company. Her gown of ivory silk, adorned with seed pearls and silver embroidery, had required the labor of a dozen seamstresses over the course of 6 weeks. The Fairfax family diamonds, including a tiara that had graced the heads of duchesses for 3 generations, caught the candlelight and scattered rainbow prisms across the marble floors. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure that showcased both the jewels and the classical beauty of her features, while her pale complexion had been enhanced with the subtle cosmetics deemed appropriate for a lady of her elevated station. The formal announcement of the engagement was scheduled to take place at midnight, following an evening of dancing, elaborate dining, and the carefully orchestrated social interactions that would cement the alliance between 2 of England's most powerful families. Lord Pemberton had prepared a speech celebrating not only the union of their children but the strengthening of bonds that had connected the Pemberton and Fairfax families for generations. The Duke of Westmoreland had travelled from his seat in Northumberland specifically for the occasion, bringing with him a delegation of relatives and political allies whose presence underscored the national significance of the match. Yet even as the evening's festivities reached their peak, Alexander found himself increasingly desperate to escape the suffocating weight of expectation and obligation that pressed upon him from every side. His dance with Lady Margaret, performed before the admiring eyes of England's most influential families, felt like a public exhibition of his capitulation to a future he could not bring himself to embrace. Her conversation, limited to expressions of gratitude for the honor of their engagement and speculation about the wedding arrangements already being planned by their mothers, struck him as the hollow echo of a life he was meant to live but could never truly inhabit. Unknown to the celebrating aristocrats, Isabella had positioned herself in the garden behind the Pemberton townhouse, drawn by a desperate need to witness from afar the moment when Alexander would be permanently lost to her forever. Her position among the ornamental shrubs that screened the garden from the street allowed her to observe the brilliant scene within the mansion through the tall windows that opened onto the terrace. She had told herself that seeing Alexander accept his destiny would provide the closure necessary to finally release her own impossible dreams and accept the reality of their different worlds. The moment that changed everything came when Alexander, overwhelmed by the weight of his impending engagement announcement, stepped onto the terrace for a breath of fresh air away from the crowded ballroom. The cool night air carried the scent of the garden's night-blooming flowers, providing a stark contrast to the hothouse atmosphere of aristocratic celebration within. As he stood alone in the moonlight, wrestling with his conscience and his duty, he caught sight of a familiar figure among the garden's shadows and recognized Isabella despite the darkness that surrounded her. Their meeting in the moonlit garden possessed all the dramatic intensity of the romantic poetry they had both cherished during their youth. Isabella had intended to retreat immediately upon being discovered, but Alexander's anguished call of her name froze her in place like a physical force. As he approached her hiding place among the roses, she found herself unable to maintain the careful distance she had preserved throughout their recent encounters. The formal barriers of their respective positions seemed to dissolve in the silvered light of the full moon, leaving only 2 hearts that had been separated by the cruel machinations of social convention. Alexander poured out his soul to Isabella in that magical garden setting, confessing that 5 years of separation had only intensified his love for her and his conviction that their connection transcended the artificial boundaries of birth and class. He spoke of the misery of his enforced courtship of Lady Margaret, the emptiness of a future built upon duty rather than affection, and his growing belief that true happiness was worth any sacrifice demanded by society. His words tumbled forth with the passion of a man who had finally found the courage to speak truths he had carried in silence for too long. Isabella's response revealed the depth of her own suffering and the strength of her character as she struggled between love and loyalty, desire and duty. She acknowledged her unchanged feelings for Alexander while insisting that their love could only bring destruction to both their families. Her position in society, she reminded him, was entirely dependent upon maintaining an irreproachable reputation, while his future as Earl required a marriage that would strengthen rather than compromise his family standing. The romantic poetry they had both treasured painted pictures of love conquering all obstacles, but reality demanded sacrifices that neither of them had the right to impose upon those who depended upon them. The crisis reached its peak when Lady Margaret, having noticed Alexander's prolonged absence from the ballroom, ventured onto the terrace in search of her intended husband. Her discovery of Alexander in intimate conversation with an unknown young woman in the garden sent shockwaves through her understanding of their engagement and her own position in society. Her scream of outrage brought Lord and Lady Pemberton rushing from the ballroom, followed by the Duke of Westmoreland and a significant portion of the evening's guests, all eager to discover the source of the commotion that had disrupted their celebration. The scene that unfolded in the garden under the scrutiny of London's most powerful families marked the end of one chapter in both families' histories and the beginning of another fraught with consequences that none of them could have anticipated. Lord Pemberton's face, illuminated by the torches hastily brought from the house, showed the controlled fury of a man whose carefully laid plans had been destroyed by his son's inexplicable behavior. Lady Catherine's expression revealed the mixture of horror and determination that marked her realization that desperate measures would be required to salvage their family's reputation from the scandal that threatened to engulf them. Isabella's humiliation was complete as she found herself the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, her carefully maintained position in society destroyed in a single moment of discovered emotion. The whispered speculation of the assembled aristocrats, their faces a mixture of fascination and revulsion at the scandal unfolding before them, promised that the story would be retold in drawing rooms across London before the sun rose again. Alexander's attempt to shield Isabella from the worst of their collective scrutiny only served to confirm the suspicions that had been aroused by their clandestine meeting. The aftermath of the garden scandal erupted like a social earthquake whose tremors would reshape the lives of everyone connected to the Pemberton and Blackwood families. Within hours of the disastrous ball, Lord Pemberton had summoned his son to his private study for a confrontation that would determine Alexander's future and test the very foundations of their family relationship. The Earl's study, lined with leather-bound volumes chronicling centuries of Pemberton achievement and political influence, had witnessed many crucial family discussions, but none more momentous than the one about to unfold between father and son. Lord Pemberton, his face bearing the marks of a sleepless night spent in crisis management, stood before the ornate fireplace that had been carved by master craftsmen during the reign of Queen Anne. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, his cravat was slightly askew, his gray hair disheveled from repeated gestures of frustration, and his eyes held the hard glitter of a man whose authority had been challenged in the most public and humiliating manner possible. The morning light streaming through the tall windows revealed the deep lines that had appeared overnight around his mouth and eyes, aging him visibly under the weight of scandal. Alexander faced his father with the resolution of a man who had finally chosen his path, regardless of the consequences that would follow. Gone was the dutiful son who had accepted without question the limitations and expectations of his privileged birth. In his place stood a young man who had discovered that some things were worth fighting for, even at the cost of everything he had been raised to value. His appearance, while still bearing the unmistakable marks of aristocratic breeding, showed a new strength of character that had been forged in the crucible of forbidden love and social rebellion. The conversation between father and son unfolded with the formality of a diplomatic negotiation, each man choosing his words with careful precision while underlying emotions threatened to break through the veneer of civilized discourse. Lord Pemberton began by outlining the extensive damage that Alexander's behavior had inflicted upon the family's reputation, relationships, and political alliances. The Duke of Westmoreland had withdrawn his consent to the marriage between Alexander and Lady Margaret, taking with him not only a substantial dowry but also crucial political support that the Pemberton family had counted upon for generations. Alexander listened to his father's recitation of consequences with growing resolve rather than remorse, recognizing that each disaster enumerated by the Earl represented another step toward the freedom he had never dared to imagine possible. When Lord Pemberton demanded to know the identity of the young woman whose presence had destroyed their family's carefully constructed plans, Alexander's response shocked his father with its directness and defiance. Isabella Blackwood, he declared, was the woman he loved and intended to marry, regardless of the social conventions that declared such a union impossible. The revelation that the object of Alexander's affections was the daughter of former family servants struck Lord Pemberton with the force of a physical blow. His memories of Margaret Blackwood's devoted service and Isabella's presence in the household during her childhood made Alexander's declaration even more incomprehensible and unforgivable. That his heir should throw away centuries of family honor for a connection with someone so far beneath their social station represented not just rebellion but a fundamental rejection of everything the Pemberton name represented. Meanwhile, across London, Isabella faced her own reckoning as Lady Hartwell summoned her for an immediate explanation of the previous evening's events. News of the scandal had reached the Hartwell household through the extensive network of servants and tradespeople who connected the great houses of Mayfair, bringing with it the detailed gossip that would soon make Isabella's name synonymous with social climbing and sexual impropriety throughout fashionable society. Lady Hartwell, whose own precarious position in society depended upon maintaining the highest standards of respectability, could not afford to employ a governess whose reputation had been compromised by association with scandal. Her dismissal of Isabella was delivered with the cold efficiency of a woman protecting her own family's interests, though she tempered her severity with a generous severance payment that would allow Isabella some time to secure new employment far from London's social circles. Isabella's departure from the Hartwell household marked the beginning of a period of exile that would test her character and determination in ways she had never imagined. With her reputation in tatters and her prospects for employment in any respectable household effectively destroyed, she faced the prospect of returning to her mother's family in the north of England, where her disgrace would cast a shadow over their modest but previously unblemished standing in their local community. The intervention that would change both their destinies came from an unexpected source: Thomas Blackwood, Isabella's father, who had maintained his position as Lord Pemberton's personal valet through decades of faithful service and unquestioned loyalty. His request for a private interview with his master represented a risk that could have cost him his livelihood and his family's security, but his love for his daughter and his intimate knowledge of the Pemberton family dynamics gave him insights that others lacked. Thomas Blackwood's conversation with Lord Pemberton took place in the Earl's dressing room, where the ritual of daily grooming had created an intimacy that transcended their respective social positions. Over 20 years of service, Thomas had observed the loneliness that had marked Alexander's childhood, the strain that had developed between the Earl and his son as Alexander matured into independent thought, and the growing emptiness that had characterized the young man's enforced participation in society's matrimonial marketplace. The valet's proposal shocked Lord Pemberton with its audacity and practical wisdom. Rather than allowing the scandal to destroy both families, Thomas suggested, why not legitimize the connection between Alexander and Isabella through marriage? Such a union would be unprecedented in the Pemberton family history, but it would also be legal, honest, and capable of being presented to society as an eccentric but not criminal choice. The alternative, watching Alexander descend into the kind of dissolution that had destroyed other aristocratic sons who rebelled against their destiny, promised only further scandal and ultimate disgrace. Thomas Blackwood's arguments were strengthened by his intimate knowledge of Isabella's character and accomplishments. Her education, he pointed out, surpassed that of many aristocratic ladies, while her beauty and natural grace would allow her to fulfill the social obligations required of a countess. Most importantly, her genuine love for Alexander offered the possibility of a marriage based upon mutual affection and respect rather than the cold calculation that had characterized aristocratic unions for generations. The Earl's consideration of this unprecedented proposal was influenced by practical realities as well as paternal affection. Alexander's public rejection of Lady Margaret Fairfax had already damaged the family's standing among their traditional allies. Further rebellion promised only greater scandal and the possibility of complete social ostracism. A marriage to Isabella Blackwood, while shocking to conventional society, could be presented as a romantic gesture that would eventually be forgiven by a public that had always been fascinated by stories of love crossing class boundaries. Lady Catherine's reaction to her husband's tentative acceptance of their son's choice provided the final dramatic confrontation that would determine their family's future. Her initial horror at the prospect of accepting a servant's daughter as her eventual successor gradually gave way to a grudging recognition that Isabella's education and character might indeed qualify her for the role, particularly if her birth could be elevated through careful manipulation of genealogical records and social presentation. The negotiations that followed between the Pemberton and Blackwood families resembled nothing so much as a diplomatic treaty being hammered out between sovereign nations. Terms were established for Isabella's formal introduction to society as Alexander's intended bride, including her temporary residence with distant relatives who could provide appropriate chaperonage and social credentials. Her education was to be supplemented with intensive instruction in the specific skills required of a countess, while her family history was to be researched and, where necessary, enhanced to provide the kind of distinguished ancestry that society would eventually accept. The transformation of Isabella Blackwood from governess to future countess required all the skill and determination that had made the Pemberton family masters of English society for 3 centuries. Lady Catherine, once convinced that her son's happiness was worth the temporary scandal of an unconventional marriage, threw herself into the project with the same energy she had previously devoted to his engagement with Lady Margaret Fairfax. The campaign to establish Isabella's social credentials would become a masterpiece of aristocratic manipulation and public relations. The first step in Isabella's elevation required her temporary removal from London to Pemberton Hall in Hertfordshire, where she could be properly prepared for her new role away from the gossiping eyes of fashionable society. The estate that had been the scene of her childhood happiness now became the setting for an intensive education in the complex requirements of aristocratic life. Lady Catherine personally supervised Isabella's instruction in the subtle arts of household management, social precedence, and political diplomacy that would be essential to her success as Alexander's wife. Isabella's natural intelligence and refined education proved invaluable during this period of transformation. Her familiarity with literature, history, and the arts provided a solid foundation upon which to build the specialized knowledge required of a countess. Under Lady Catherine's exacting tutelage, she mastered the intricate protocols of entertaining, the delicate art of managing multiple households with hundreds of servants, and the complex web of family relationships and political alliances that would shape her future responsibilities. The genealogical research undertaken to enhance Isabella's family background revealed unexpected treasures that would prove crucial to her acceptance by society. Thomas Blackwood's ancestry, when traced back through parish records and family documents, revealed connections to minor Scottish nobility whose bloodlines, while modest, were undeniably aristocratic. More importantly, Margaret Blackwood's family history included a grandmother who had been the natural daughter of a Welsh baronet, a connection that, while irregular, provided the kind of noble blood that could justify Isabella's elevation in the eyes of those who valued breeding above all else. Alexander's role during this period of preparation was that of devoted suitor and patient teacher, helping Isabella navigate the complex social landscape she would soon be required to master. Their relationship, now conducted under the watchful eyes of Lady Catherine and properly chaperoned according to aristocratic custom, deepened into the kind of partnership that had always been his ideal of marriage. Their conversations, ranging from poetry and philosophy to estate management and political theory, revealed intellectual compatibility that promised to sustain their union far beyond the physical attraction that had first drawn them together. The formal announcement of their engagement was carefully orchestrated to minimize scandal while maximizing the romantic appeal of their unconventional love story. Lady Catherine chose the midsummer ball at Pemberton Hall as the setting for Isabella's debut as Alexander's intended bride, calculating that the estate's magnificent setting would provide the most advantageous backdrop for presenting their transformed governess to county society. The ball would also serve as a test of Isabella's social skills and the effectiveness of their campaign to legitimize her position. The weeks preceding the midsummer ball witnessed a flurry of activity as Pemberton Hall was prepared for an event that would either establish Isabella's social success or confirm her failure to transcend her origins. The ballroom, which had witnessed centuries of aristocratic celebration, was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements featuring roses from the estate's famous gardens, their perfume mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and the subtle fragrance of expensive perfumes that would be worn by the assembled guests. Isabella's gown for the occasion represented the culmination of Lady Catherine's efforts to transform her from servant's daughter to future countess. Created by London's most exclusive modiste, the dress of midnight blue silk was adorned with silver embroidery and sapphires that complemented both her striking coloring and the Pemberton family jewels she would wear as Alexander's acknowledged bride. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that showcased the diamond tiara that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, while her deportment training allowed her to carry herself with the natural grace that marked true aristocratic breeding. The response of county society to Isabella's presentation as future Lady Pemberton proved more favorable than even Lady Catherine had dared to hope. Her beauty, elegance, and obvious intelligence impressed even the most skeptical observers, while her genuine affection for Alexander was evident to all who witnessed their interactions. The romantic story of their childhood friendship and enduring love, carefully edited to emphasize noble sentiment over social rebellion, captured the imagination of guests who had grown weary of the calculating marriages that characterized their social circle. The wedding of Alexander Pemberton and Isabella Blackwood, celebrated in the ancient chapel of Pemberton Hall on a perfect autumn morning in 1825, represented the triumphant conclusion of their struggle against social convention and family opposition. The ceremony, conducted according to the traditional rites of the Church of England, was attended by family members and close friends whose presence signified their acceptance of the unconventional union. Isabella's bridal gown, created from silk that had been woven specifically for the occasion, was embellished with lace that had adorned Pemberton brides for 4 generations, symbolizing her full acceptance into the family heritage. The years that followed their marriage proved that love could indeed triumph over social prejudice when supported by determination, intelligence, and strategic planning. Isabella's natural talents for administration and diplomacy made her an invaluable partner in managing the vast Pemberton estates, while her genuine concern for the welfare of their tenants and employees earned her a reputation for compassion that enhanced rather than diminished the family's standing in the community. Her success in producing 2 healthy sons ensured the continuation of the Pemberton line while providing tangible proof of the wisdom of Alexander's unconventional choice. Alexander's evolution from dutiful heir to devoted husband and father represented his own victory over the constraints of aristocratic expectation. His political career, enhanced rather than hindered by his marriage to Isabella, was marked by progressive reforms that reflected their shared commitment to social justice and individual merit over inherited privilege. Their partnership in both private and public life became a model for other couples who dared to place personal happiness above social convention. The acceptance of Isabella by London society came gradually but inevitably as her grace, intelligence, and dedication to charitable causes won over even her most skeptical critics. Her transformation from governess to countess became the stuff of romantic legend, inspiring other young people to believe that true love could overcome any obstacle. The salons she hosted at both Pemberton Hall and their London residence became famous for their intellectual atmosphere and the quality of conversation that brought together writers, artists, and political figures regardless of their social origins. The final vindication of their love came with Isabella's presentation at court, where her beauty and dignity impressed even King George IV, who was known for his appreciation of exceptional women regardless of their backgrounds. Her acceptance by the highest levels of society marked the complete success of their campaign to legitimize their unconventional union and proved that character and accomplishment could ultimately triumph over the accidents of birth. As they stood together in the portrait gallery of Pemberton Hall, surrounded by paintings of ancestors who had never imagined that their heir would choose love over duty, Alexander and Isabella represented the possibility of change within even the most traditional institutions. Their children, raised with an appreciation for both privilege and responsibility, would carry forward the legacy of their parents' courage in choosing happiness over convention. The love story that had begun in childhood games among the rose gardens of Hertfordshire had evolved into a marriage that strengthened rather than weakened the aristocratic ideals of honor, duty, and service to others. Their triumph over social prejudice and family opposition proved that true partnership between equals, based upon mutual respect and shared values, could create a union more powerful than any alliance built solely upon political or financial considerations. The epilogue to their remarkable story would be written in the lives of their descendants, who inherited not only wealth and position but also the legacy of courage and conviction that had enabled their parents to transform the impossible dream of childhood love into the enduring reality of a marriage that enriched not only their own lives but the lives of all who knew them. Their example would inspire generations of lovers who dared to believe that the human heart could triumph over the artificial barriers created by society, proving that love, when supported by character and determination, possessed the power to reshape the world according to its own generous vision.